Hey guys, it's Mary and welcome back to Study Journey. Welcome back to the Python series. This is the second episode of the News Monitor game, and we're going to be continuing our code from the previous episode and just working on our problem. So without further ado, let's get into the video. So in the previous episode, we have just finished problem 1, which is news story. And now that we have this, we can move on and look at parsing the feed. So parsing is a process of turning a data stream into a structured format that is more convenient to work with. And for triggers. Oh, wait, delete the part about parsing the feed. So now let's look at triggers. So given a set of news stories, your program will generate alerts for a subset of these stories. Stories with alerts will be displayed to the user, and the other stories will be silently discarded. We will represent alerting rules as triggers. A trigger is a rule that is evaluated over a single news story and may fire to generate an alert. So for example, a simple trigger could fire for every news story whose title contained the phrase Microsoft Office. Another trigger may be set up to fire for all news stories where the description contained the phrase Boston. Finally, a more specific trigger could be set up to fire only when a news story contained both the phrases Microsoft and Boston in the description. So in order to simplify our code, we will actually use object polymorphism, and we will define a trigger interface and then implement a number of different classes that implement that trigger interface in different ways. So it's going to make more sense when we start doing it, but the first thing is going to be the trigger interface. So each trigger class you define must evaluate the following interface, either directly or transitively. And it must implement the evaluate method that gives a news item, so news story object, as an input and returns true if an alert should be generated for that item. And we will not directly use the implementation of the trigger class, which is why it raises an exception should anyone attempt to use it. And the class below implements the trigger interface, and any subclass that inherits from it will have an evaluate method. By default, they will use the evaluate method in trigger the superclass unless they define their own evaluate function, which would then be used instead. And if some subclass neglects to define its own evaluate method, it then calls to it will go to trigger.evaluate. Which, if that fails, which fails with the not implemented error, and that's what we have right there, and that is in the beginning. That is in the beginning of triggers, as we see right here. So we're going to define a number of classes that inherit from trigger, and because there's not just one type of trigger, but there's a lot of different types of triggers, but it's only all going to fall under this trigger class. So trigger is a superclass, which means all other classes inherit from it. And the arrow from phrase trigger to trigger means that phrase trigger inherits from trigger. So a phrase trigger is a trigger, so is a not trigger, and trigger, etc. Now, the first thing we're going to do is phrase triggers. Then we'll move on to title, description, and etc. So having a trigger that always fires obviously isn't interesting. So we're trying to sort the news. So we had to find some specific phrases that will help trigger the news. So for example, a user may want to be alerted about news items that contain specific phrases. So obviously, if the title contains Microsoft Office, we can have that as a trigger. So in the following problems, we will create a phrase trigger abstract class and implement two classes that implement this phrase trigger. And a phrase is one or more words separated by a single space between the words. So you may assume that phrase does not contain any punctuation, but here's some examples. So purple cow, all uppercase, moo, this is a phrase. But what isn't a phrase? Well, when it has punctuation or multiple spaces between words, these are not phrases. And given some text, a trigger should only fire when each word in the phrase is present in its entirety and appears consecutively in the text, separated only by spaces or punctuation. The trigger should not be case sensitive. So for example, a phrase trigger with the phrase purple cow would fire with purple cow. The purple cow is soft and cuddly. The farmer earns a really purple cow. Purple cow. This is also valid. Did you see a purple cow? See how purple and cow are next to each other. But it shouldn't fire if it's like purple cows are cool with the S, or a purple bob over there is a cow. See how purple and cow are separated? Or when it's cow purple, that doesn't work. This isn't purple cow, just purple cow, and obviously not brown cow. So dealing with all of this is kind of tricky, especially exclamation points and other punctuation that appear in the middle of the phrase. But for the purpose of our parsing, we're going to pretend that space or any character is string dot punctuation. And string dot punctuation is a word separator. So if you've never seen string dot punctuator, we can type into the Python shell and try it out. But we can play around with this a little bit and get comfortable with split, replace, join methods, and maybe we want to use lower and upper for this problem. So let's get started. It says for us to implement a phrase trigger abstract class phrase trigger, and it should take in a string phrase as an argument to the class's constructor. And this trigger should not be case sensitive, so it should treat intil and intil as being equal. Phrase trigger should be a subclass of trigger, and it has one new method, is phrase in, which takes in one string argument text and returns true if the whole phrase is present and false otherwise. And because it's an abstract class, we will not be directly insulating any phrase triggers. Phrase trigger should inherit its evaluate method from trigger. So as we can see above it, we have trigger right here with the evaluate, so we don't have to define it again. It's basically what they're saying. And we can do this because now we can create subclasses of phrase trigger and use the phrase is phrase in. So it has two subclasses, title trigger and description trigger. We're going to define this abstract class, phrase trigger, and it says that it is a subclass of trigger. So it's going to take in trigger. And as we can see, it says that it should take in a string phrase as an argument to the class's constructor. So when we initiate, which is the constructor, obviously we had to have self first, and then we're going to take in a phrase. And it says the trigger should not be case sensitive. So if we make everything lowercase, then we don't have to deal with whether it's uppercase or lowercase. So I'm going to make the phrase dot lower. And now that we have this, we're going to now define the new method is phrase in. So define is phrase in. And we're trying to find out whether this is in the text. So we should take in one string argument text. And within this, it should first obviously not be case sensitive. So I'm going to make the phrase lowercase. So self.phrase and then dot lower. And then the text, I'm also going to make it text.lower. And now that we have this, we can return true if the whole phrase is in the text and false otherwise. So if phrase is in the text, then we're going to return true. And otherwise, we're going to return false. Okay, now that we have this, in the next episode, we can define title trigger and description trigger, which are the subclasses.